This is the second part of my review of the interview between Lex Fridman and Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine. Now, before we get into this, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who's helped us to purchase a full truck. This campaign has been running throughout December, and we reached the target, not just for Silicon Curtain to purchase one truck to help Ukrainian battalions on the front, but the entire campaign managed to raise 150,000 euros, which pays for 15 trucks. So a huge thank you to the community for helping out. The next challenge is going to be actually getting some of our personal costs together as we aim to drive some of those trucks to Ukraine. But that's something I'm going to talk about in other videos and pop some links onto the channel. If you are minded to help out, then that's something you can do by buying me a coffee. It'll be tremendously helpful as we spend a reasonable chunk, a third of the end of January, actually in Ukraine, driving the trucks over and then doing a bunch of interviews and events while we were there. But more news on that in subsequent episodes. When preparing this second part episode based on the Fridman interview, I was going to go through the interview chronologically and respond to each part, but many YouTubers have already done this, and many of you will now have seen the interview in its entirety already, so this likely won't be of great value. Zelensky's answers, for the most part, are absolutely superb and push back strongly against Russian disinformation narratives, far better than I can do. So I won't be repeating Zelensky's responses. You can hear those for yourselves. This is perhaps one of Zelensky's most forceful and accessible interviews. In some way, it's the naivety and what could be described as ignorance of context on the part of Fridman that triggers Zelensky into providing some of the most compelling answers ever given to Russian narratives and talking points, many of which have unfortunately been adopted by the MAGA bubble, as well as some in conservative political circles. One would also say, it must be said by some in the far left and those who have been traditionally seen the Soviet Union as a template for alternative society to capitalism and as an antidote to American imperialism. Well, both are deeply misguided, as Russia is a classical imperialist entity, perhaps one of the most brutal imperial powers in history, and not a template for any kind of civilization that a reasonable person should aspire to live in or help to build. So, in this episode, I'm going to examine the Russian myths and propagandistic narratives that are source for what seems to be much of Lex Fridman's research. He claims at the end of the interview to have consumed many books on the history of Ukraine and Russia, its imperial domination of the region, and more recent history that led up to full-scale war. But unfortunately, his choice of themes and the construction of his questions suggest to me that his sources of information are weighted towards podcasts, memes, and conversations within a political and social bubble rather than solid journalism and the writings of professional historians. There is a strong bias in Lex's framing of topics and questions towards Russian-inspired historical mythology and intentionally manufactured national myths, which seems to be a more potent source of inspiration for Lex in his choices, his priorities, and indeed the phraseology, the way he actually constructs his questions, than, I would say, reliable sources. And there are plenty of commentators, even in the Russian diaspora community, who would frame things very different from him. People such as Plyushev, such as Vladimir Milov, Michael Naki, and others. The way that Lex Fridman frames his questions, and indeed some of the choice of his questions, suggests to me that he is not consuming those sources, even in the Russian language. So here is a breakdown of nearly all of Lex's questions that span the 3-hour interview and how each correlate to a greater or lesser extent to common Russian narratives and talking points. Some of the topics, of course, are perfectly valid to bring up, and Russian propaganda rarely manufactures issues from scratch. It leverages existing problems, pours petrol on the flames of real conflicts, and seeks to widen and weaponize existing divisions. But propaganda utilizes these issues and Lex has scored an almost complete bingo card of them. Again, I suspect that his intention is not to be propagandistic, but the framing of his questions, the language he uses, betrays a lack of depth and seriousness to his research, as well as a remarkable level of naivety about real world politics. But let's start with a topic that's taken up an excessive amount of time and energy, both prior to the interview and within the interview itself, the question of what language to conduct the interview in. In the end, Zelensky gave answers in three languages: Ukrainian, Russian, and English. Fridman says at minute 13 and 55 seconds, if we can explain why the Ukrainian language is very important, our conversation will be most effective and impactful if we speak in Russian. Now, many have tackled this from the point of view of Russian propaganda and why it's in the interests of the Kremlin. I think there may be another reason why Lex wanted to conduct the interview in Russian. We talked about various motivations for this in the episode I did 2 days ago, but here is a new angle. Zelensky was compelling in all the languages he spoke, even in English, where his grammatical English is not that great. His answers were still highly compelling, but Lex seemed stilted and awkward in both Russian and English. Friedman is perhaps setting up an excuse for himself in advance because he knows that Zelensky will be more verbally dexterous and compelling than he could ever hope to be in either Russian or even in English, making a big thing about the language it's being conducted in, making a big thing about the role of translators and how difficult it is. He's creating an excuse for himself in advance. And indeed, Zelensky actually takes a dig at Lex Fridman, at the quality of his Russian language. And indeed, I was both surprised by his accent and the poor quality of his sentence construction in Russian. Now, my Russian is not what I would call fluent, but I make no claims that it is. Lex does make such claims about his Russian, and his proficiency and verbal dexterity in Russian turn out to be extremely disappointing. If he chooses to interview Putin in Russia, then I think the dictator will make absolute mincemeat of him. At minute 16 and 58 seconds, Friedman states that he hopes that many Russians will hear this interview, that Vladimir Putin will hear this, that the American President Donald Trump, the American people will hear this, that everyone will hear this. And yes, Ukrainian language is important symbolically. But what is important, he says, is that we understand each other well. Let's put some context around this. Firstly, even if it's wildly successful and performs as well as Lex's most popular videos, it'll get around 16 million views. That is what two of his most popular ones have got, one including the one with Tucker Carlson. That's a huge audience, but it's not everybody. Will Trump listen to the whole thing? Probably not. Will Putin listen? Maybe. Will anything he hears change his intentions or worldview? Almost certainly not. And it's dangerously naive to think that he will. This question raises an interesting reflection, though. Are listening, hearing, and understanding the same things? Does understanding necessarily lead to action? There is an assumption by Lex implicit in his questions throughout the interview that listening invariably leads to understanding, that information leads to knowledge, that knowledge leads to an appreciation of moral positions, and that people are prepared to act when they have good information and strong moral positions. None of these things are automatically true, even more so when addressing a topic like Ukraine that has become so partisan within US politics and the target of both propaganda and cult-like beliefs. These assumptions about listening and understanding, understanding and action, information, knowledge and morality are a fundamental flaw of Lex's logic and indeed his entire podcast format when he's tackling political topics. On the scientific ones, he's perhaps a little more compelling and interesting. His default setting is that all people have the potential for good and that bad things arise out of miscommunication, not bad intentions on the part of the transgressor. If this is a foundational assumption, then Lex will never understand Putin's motives and actions, I fear. At the 1 hour, 45 minutes and 33 seconds point, Friedman says it will be very difficult to negotiate if you think that the president of a country is completely crazy. It'll be really hard to come to an agreement with him. You have to look at him as a serious person who loves his country and the people in his country. Friedman goes on to say, well, do you think Putin doesn't love his country? We covered this phrase in the episode 2 days ago, but this phrase is a really good indication of this. It precludes the idea that Putin can be ill-intentioned, not only towards Ukraine, but also towards his own people. But the evidence is here from 25 years of his rule that few of his decisions are taken with the best interests of the Russian people in mind. Vast resources have been expended over this time to eliminate political competition and deconstruct the vestiges of a free society and press, and to enrich and support a power vertical that perpetuates his regime. It's not about the people or their welfare. This is all about staying in control and staying in power. At minute 47, Friedman says, I disagree with you here. I think and hope that many people in Russia will hear us today. After that, he says, I simply guarantee that this conversation will travel fast on the internet. Everyone will hear you. They will hear you, including the president of Russia will hear you. This is why I have hope. Well, Lex disagrees with Zelensky. In his world, all issues are due to miscommunication, and whatever material disagreements exist, they can be resolved through dialogue and compromise. Well, that's fine with a win-win mentality. It's fine when everybody is part of the same transactional mindset where they have material goals. Well, what happens when those goals are imperialistic, when those goals are genocidal, when they go beyond the simple economic rationality? It's fine when politicians are answerable for their mistakes and wastage to their electorate. But Putin is not answerable to anybody except the small clique that helps him maintain power. And he operates a strictly win-lose mentality, a zero-sum game when he can only triumph if his opponent demonstratively loses. In the cases of Nemtsov and Navalny, losing their lives. To some extent, Lex is correct. Many Russians, especially in the diaspora that emigrated from the 1990s through to Putin's full-scale war, do watch opposition media in Russia, and in huge quantities. You just have to look at the view rates on many of the diaspora journalist platforms. Each video can gather many millions of views. Many excellent journalists work for these platforms and broadcast excellent information. That produced by Michael Naki, Mark Fagan, for instance, is superb and contains a highly moral stance on the war. But listening to news content and actively challenging one's own biases and internal myths are not necessarily the same things. Consuming information and having a political stance are also not the same thing at all. Translating information into oppositional action are not the same thing. Even good information by itself will not change the world nor end the war. Only direct, organized and principled action can. At minute 22, Friedman says, let's do this. How about you, my friend? Joe Rogan and I will go get some Texas barbecue together. He's inviting Zelensky along for the ride here. And Zelensky, with a fair degree of irony, I think, asks who will pay. Well, what is he hinting at here? Because Zelensky goes on to say, well, Putin needs to pay for everything. Is he hinting in some ways that Putin is already footing the bills for some of the informational space that we are viewing and some of the figures in it? I wonder whether that's pushing Zelensky's words too far, but it's a curious moment in the interview. At minute 40, Friedman says that morning of February 22nd changed everything. Can you tell me about that morning? Can you tell me about the technical, political, military aspects of it and the decisions you had to make? Well, this is quite an interesting question, actually. I think it's a fair question and it's an interesting one. Many Russians, unfortunately, believe that it's Zelensky and his clique that are a barrier to peace. Remove them and everything will be right. The Russian elite now know this not to be true, and it's been demonstrated in the massacres of Bucha, Irpin, and Mariupol, largely against Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and latterly the terror in Kherson and Pokrovsk. These are happening precisely because the Russian elite have come to realize that actually the Ukrainian people are with their leaders. They don't see their leaders as a sort of inconsequential puppets. Putin now understands that this is a war against all Ukrainians. And it's an important point there because Zelensky is not just making these decisions for his own benefit, the benefit is government. I think it's quite clear he's making these decisions for the benefit of his people. And he, by and large, has the support of his people in these decisions. So it's an important question, it's an important nuance, and an interesting part of the conversation. At minute number 52, Fridman says, I think this requires strength. That is, negotiations is what he means. There are a lot of carrots and sticks that can be used here to make a real deal. And Trump is very keen on making a deal and ready to negotiate. Carrots and sticks. Now, this reveals a lot about how I think Friedman is approaching this conflict, and I think it's not correct. The question almost implies that ultimately the combatants want similar things for their own people, even if their objectives are not aligned on a state level, that there is a transactional resolution to the conflict and that a deal can be found. Well, evidence suggests that Putin wants very different things from Ukraine, and that many of his demands are completely incompatible with the idea of Ukraine existing as an independent sovereign state, are incompatible with the idea of Ukraine being in control of its security and its own resources. These are not things that can be ironed out in a kind of transactional dialogue. They are fundamentally incompatible. So I think this is something that really has not quite filtered through to Friedman and perhaps the bubble that he represents. At the 1 hour and 5 minute level, Friedman says it's important to say what you said about the children is a tragedy, war is hell. But let me say again, we must find a path to peace. War is hell. This is both a cliche and, of course, it's true. But the resolution to the resolution is not as simple as Friedman, Trump, and Musk possibly believe, especially when that war is imperialistic and genocidal in character. This is not a disagreement between two sovereign states, but between one that seeks to preserve its liberty and develop its own institutions and a larger neighboring state that seeks to erase them. It assumes that ultimately both sides want peace. This is a huge and possibly erroneous assumption. Ukraine cannot and should not accept peace at any price, and it is highly questionable whether Putin needs peace at all. At 1 hour and 7 minutes, Friedman says, your idea is that NATO accepts Ukraine minus the 5 regions of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea. Unfortunately, he mispronounces Zaporizhia. Whether that's a slip or poor research, I don't know. Friedman goes on to say, this is difficult because you're asking for a lot. You're saying to continue the sanctions on Russia, to accept Ukraine into NATO, etc. I think difficult questions need to be asked about this. Then he drops perhaps what is the most tone-deaf phrase, and he comes back to it again and repeats it twice. He says, what can you say about guaranteeing Russia's security? Well, this is perhaps the most gratuitous phrase that Lex uttered, the closest he comes to expressing an extreme propagandist point of view. You cannot talk about guaranteeing Russian security unless you explain what the threat to Russian security actually is. Well, prior to their invasion, there was none, at least no threat of an invasion to Russia. This is a straw man argument that was used for invading Ukraine. It's highly disingenuous to bring it up in this form. How can you expect the victim of an aggressor to guarantee the aggressor's security. It is beyond absurd. Freedom doubles down on the absurdity at 1 hour and 13 minutes when he asks, what if both Ukraine and Russia are accepted into NATO? Lex doubles down on this absurdity, which is both tone deaf and a grotesque question to ask of a president whose nation is fighting for its survival. Perhaps Lex is also totally ignorant that Russia joined the Partnership for Peace program in 1994, and in 1997, the NATO-Russia Founding Act was signed, enabling the creation of the NATO-Russia Permanent Joint Council. This means that significant efforts were made to integrate Russia into the Euro-Atlantic security architecture, to create a formal framework that would guarantee Russia's security. Putin deconstructed these and spurned any further attempts at dialogue on that subject of joint or mutual security. Since 2007, his intent has been to impose Russia's mutually exclusive security arrangements on the world and on Europe, not to pursue security at a partnership level. This question also talks to the highly propagandistic trope, also repeated by Trump this very week, that NATO expansion provoked Russia to invade Ukraine and threatened its security. This is a red herring, as there was no appetite in Ukraine to join NATO in 2014 when Russia first invaded. But more fundamental than that, Putin fully understands there was never a danger of NATO mounting an invasion of Russia. It was Western weakness and appeasement that provoked Putin, not strength. It's unfortunate that this piece of disinformation is the most persistent and works just as well on leftists, right-wing MAGA, Russians, and so on. It is such an easy argument to disprove, and yet one which is not challenged nearly enough. At 1 hour 16, Fridman says there are many options for peace that don't involve NATO, inviting Ukraine as a member. Can you imagine security guarantees without NATO membership, for example? What if America simply leaves NATO? I believe there is a high likelihood that Donald Trump would do such a thing. Friedman says that there could be security guarantees in the absence of NATO, and by implication in the absence of the US being a party of those security guarantees. This is perhaps an interesting and certainly a valid question. But Friedman reveals something interesting here. Whether he said these things just because he's taken them from various public statements, or whether he's been party to some behind-the-scenes conversations, this would be really interesting to understand. But the idea of the US leaving NATO is extraordinary and presents incredible risks to Europe. What security guarantees would exist for Ukraine in the event of NATO folding? Well, Lex believes there is a high likelihood of NATO expiring on Trump's watch, whether by design or by accident. In this circumstance, it would be down to coalitions of the willing to defend both Ukrainian and European interests. It is inconceivable that the UK would not be a part of that. Well, these are truly interesting times. Zelensky insists that security through NATO is the only feasible way, but privately, Ukraine must be making alternative plans and seeking more dependable alliances, because the power of deterrence inherent in NATO and Article 5, one really must question what the longevity of that is, and whether actually, even at this point, it is going to be that effective as we trundle through 2025 and the next 4 years of a Trump presidency. At the 1 hour and 20-minute mark, Friedman says, I have a dream. Let's say on January 25th or sometime at the end of January this year, you'll sit down with Donald Trump, with Vladimir Putin, together negotiate a ceasefire about security guarantees. At this point, it is barely conceivable that Putin would be seen together with Zelensky, let alone in a cordial and diplomatic setting. The murderer intent on disemboweling and annihilating your state, responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands, the murder and rape of women and children. The idea that some kind of cordial entente is possible is just pure fantasy on the part of Friedman. It simply won't happen. At 1 hour and 36 minutes, Friedman says a lot of ideas, partnerships with a global south, India, Middle East, Saudi Arabia, economic partnerships. He goes on to talk about maybe even military partnerships and contracts that could be made between Ukraine, United States, China that might guarantee peace in some way. Well, partnerships with countries that have shown they don't give a toss about Ukraine or democratic values as long as they can get their energy a few dollars cheaper per barrel. That is not the basis of any kind of security. The idea that such relationships would provide security to Ukraine is beyond laughable. It's an insult to our intelligence and counters everything reality has shown us in the last 3 years. Even some of Ukraine's staunchest allies have been loath to cut their independence, or their dependence rather, on Russian LNG or close loopholes in goods being exported to Russia via intermediary companies. That includes many of Ukraine's strongest allies in Europe. No one has put their economies on a war footing apart from Russia and Ukraine, and no one is yet willing to make the economic and political sacrifices that will be required to push Russia back across its borders. At 1 hour 42, Friedman says this is not a small compromise, and to forgive him will not be a small compromise. He's talking here about making a deal with Putin and even finding a way to forgive him for the innumerable crimes that he has committed. No, this is not just a small compromise Lex is talking about here. It's an impossible one. You cannot negotiate with someone who has come to kill you and your children. Not recognizing this reality and the intent behind Putin's actions is a dangerous delusion. At the 1 hour and 52-minute point, Friedman asks, what do you think? Will there ever be a day when Ukrainian people forgive the Russian people and both peoples will travel back and forth again and marry each other, rekindle and form friendships, etc.? To ask the leader of a nation at war, fighting for its survival against a genocidal dictator, if he can find it in his heart to forgive the aggressor, even while the missiles and drones are crashing down on Ukrainian territory, on Ukrainian cities and civilians, it's not just tone deaf, it's obscene. This question alone, for me, condemns Lex as an amateurish, simplistic, and frankly, unpleasant person. He lacks here basic human empathy or intelligence in the line of questioning. He's managed to secure an audience with one of history's great leaders at a pivotal moment in the history of the democratic world, and he asks such inane and simplistic questions. It's a grotesque waste of an opportunity for which he ought to be ashamed. At 1 hour and 55 minutes, Friedman says, what do you admire? What do you respect about Donald Trump? Etc., etc. He then goes on later in the interview to talk about perceptions of corruption. He states that people like Donald Trump and Elon Musk really care about fighting corruption. In the previous episode, many people have protested that I have some kind of animus or bias against Lex, that actually Lex is an honest participant in these debates. Lex is just asking questions. He's not biased. He's not aligned with one party or the other. For those protesting about me, for suggesting that Lex is disingenuous in his questioning, and the formative political interviews especially are disingenuous, then this question here is a clear rebuke to that. Lex claims to be on the side of peace and love, truth and objectivity, yet he clearly aligns himself with only one part of the political spectrum, that is extreme libertarian populists. I would not even call them conservatives anymore because they share few features in common with traditional conservative values and the tone of debate that conservatives have traditionally engaged in. They are radical, even revolutionary populists who admire autocrats and capricious authoritarian methods. Lex is not objective and does not entertain politicians of all persuasions equally. He pretends to be impartial, but he is leaning heavily on one side of the scales to the detriment of the other. There is a clear bias by association going on here. There is cover being created for Trump and his coterie, and a form of gaslighting implicit in Lex's methodology. It is highly disingenuous. At hour 2 and 6 minutes, Friedman says difficult decisions you had to make when the war began is to enact martial law. You did it to defend freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc. But a lot of freedoms had to be curtailed, sacrificed in this fight. You see the tension. Do you feel the tension? The sacrifice that's had to be made, the sacrifice of democracy. Zelensky, and this is the only point where I'll quote Zelensky's answer, and that is, in any case, this war is for our freedom. If Ukraine did not resist, none of these democratic principles would survive. I think this is an important point to make. Also, it's perhaps overstated the amount of democratic freedom that Ukrainians have given up in order to fight the war. In fact, Ukraine is operating perhaps the freest media that has ever operated in a country that is involved in total war for its survival. Certainly, its media is far freer than the British media was during the Second World War to report what is going on. But on elections, this is a valid topic to raise and one which many Ukrainians discuss as well as politicians in the US. But Friedman introduces the topic with a highly misleading framing. This may be down to pure ignorance and lack of research or just linguistic sloppiness, but it is highly regrettable nonetheless. But immediately it puts Zelensky on the defensive. Elections were not delayed in Ukraine again and again and again, but they were only suspended because of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. To characterize this situation as something that is politically motivated is false, and to not explain the tension, as he calls it, as something that arose from Russia's actions is poor framing, and not to explain that actually elections cannot be held constitutionally during this state of war is also a significant omission. At 2 hours and 10 minutes, Friedman says, when do you think you will hold elections? Because people don't know because of martial law, etc. And then he goes on to say, well, what will happen in the debate between you and Zelensky, between Zelensky and Poroshenko? And he characterizes this forthcoming electoral contest in Ukraine when martial law is lifted as something that's very much down to, big leaders, big personalities slugging it out. Here we slip into something that is very common in Russian oppositional coverage of both Ukrainian politics and indeed their own Russian political scene. Everything is seen through the lens of big personalities, individuals that shape history. But Ukrainian politics is more mature than that. It's also about parties, policies, and issues, and civic society plays a huge role. So to characterize any forthcoming elections in the way of Zelensky versus Zelensky, Poroshenko versus Arestowich is highly simplistic, and yet it plays well into the Russian narrative. And actually, it does play well for a Russian audience as well that may be watching. If the political struggle can be reduced to conflicts between the interests of individuals, oligarchs, reduce the level of memes and gossip, friction, rumors, and anecdote, rather than a robust democratic political process and debate, then that serves Russia's purposes very well. At minute 17 of the second hour, Friedman says you won the presidency in big part on a message of fighting corruption. How do you counter accusations of corruption in Ukraine during the full-scale war? Well, we covered the topic of corruption in the episode 2 days ago. It's certainly a valid topic for Lex to have raised and to explored in detail. Ukraine has not totally triumphed over corruption, but indeed, any state at war historically has always had high levels of corruption. This isn't unique to Ukraine or these circumstances. And it's important that this topic was raised because it's a core focus of Russian propaganda. And it's important for it to have been discussed in this recording. At our 2 minute 33, Friedman says, they say in America this question of who is really in power. For example, oligarchs, American politicians, Yermak and others. I only ask this because of things I've heard during my trips to Ukraine. But Lex says something, perhaps it's the strongest statement he makes during the interview. Lex says that it's very interesting that Zelensky is a free agent. That is his impression from his visits to Ukraine and is not a puppet controlled by Russia or the US. I think out of everything that Lex says, that is perhaps the clearest indication that Lex is not a direct Russian asset. The fact that he's given Zelensky this platform to put forward his views has not interrupted him and has, I suspect, broadcasted pretty much the whole interview. So there's a lot of naivety implicit in the way Lex has positioned the questions. It reveals a lot about him, his personality, and the bubble he operates in. But on the plus side, it's given Zelensky a chance to express himself fully and in a very compelling way. Well, that's the end of the topics covered. Do I think Lex Fridman is a Russian asset, at least in the sense of being briefed and managed like an agent? No, I do not. Is he consciously distorting the narrative to benefit the Kremlin? I suspect not as well. But unfortunately, his lack of context, historical depth, and I would say the absence of cynicism on his part inevitably lead to bias in his choice of topics, the construction of his questions, the prioritization he gives them, and the phraseology he uses when actually putting those questions to Zelensky. These same flaws in both his background understanding but also his interview format meant that he did not come back at Zelensky with probing or pertinent questions. That is a huge absence in this interview and indeed in his technique. There was no drill down, no real challenges presented to Zelensky. Rather, the interview drifted inconsequentially from one topic to another, rather like working its way through a list. However, the interview was worthwhile because of the quality of Zelensky's performance and the fact that this material will teach people who may never have heard Zelensky speak before and may have been indifferent to or biased against Ukraine because of the informational bubbles they inhabit. This is not just true for MAGA, but for people across the political spectrum that may have tuned out from news about the war, chose to look away, or have been exposed to Russian narratives. This was an important interview, an important platform to introduce Zelensky to many people who will not have paid attention to his words before, and a few of them may have had their minds changed about Zelensky as a person, as a leader, and about Ukraine's cause in general.